Alrighty, hello and welcome to tonight's Equity Roundtable. Tonight we're talking about leveraging the Draft SEIS public comment process to catalyze community change. My name's Lucy Hamer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be your facilitator tonight. These Equity Roundtables bring together IBR staff and subject matter experts to discuss the intersection of equity and infrastructure projects. Tonight we'll focus on engaging equity priority communities in the public comment period. The Draft SEIS is the comprehensive documentation of the program's potential benefits and impacts on transportation within the study area, the community, and the environment. Now I'd like to introduce Gregory or Greg C. Johnson. He is the program administrator for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. In his role, Johnson jointly represents both the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Washington State Department of Transportation, or ODOT or WashDOT, to lead the bi-state IBR program in replacing the aging interstate bridge across the Columbia River with a seismically resilient multimodal structure that provides improved mobility for people, goods, and services. Johnson has a proven history in effective transportation leadership in the private and public sectors, including over 20 years as a senior executive in the transportation industry. I will now turn it to Greg to give us some welcoming remarks. Greg?
Thank you, Lucy. Well, once again, it's our pleasure to present this roundtable. So we're here to talk about leveraging the draft supplemental environmental impact statement process to catalyze community change. So this is the 9th installment in our series, which was created as a forum for important discussions about how our bi-state infrastructure program can benefit all members of our diverse community. By bringing these different voices to the table, we are ensuring that equity priority communities are front and center in everything that we do. Tonight, we're going to focus on one of the most significant milestones of our program to date. Next Friday, which is September 20th, we will publish our draft supplemental environmental impact statement. Its release will mark the beginning of an official 60-day public comment period, which will run through November 18th. The draft supplemental environmental impact statement addresses the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which was created to encourage community members to be a part of the federal agency's decision-making. So during the public comment period, the community is encouraged to review the document and provide feedback on the many benefits and impacts of these program investments, including the proposed design options and technical analysis. So public input will help inform technical analysis, design options, and refine the preferred alternative that will move into the final supplemental environmental impact statement, including the program's footprint and mitigations that will be necessary. And although we've had tremendous community involvement over the past 4 years, simply put, this is the most important time for community members to use their voice and make their opinions heard on this program. So tonight we're going to discuss how to navigate this document and the public comment process. This will include a discussion on the impact of public feedback, best practices for effective comments, and strategies for equity and public participation. We'll also talk about other large infrastructure projects and illustrate how public input has helped shape them to demonstrate how public comment can indeed influence the end result of our program. So we're looking forward to tonight's discussion. So thanks again for being here with us this evening. Back to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Greg. I'd now like to introduce the other panelists who are joining us tonight. First is Chris Regan. He is the IBR Environmental Manager. So Chris Regan is the Environmental Manager for the IBR program. He comes to us from WashDOT, where he was most recently served as the Southwest Region Environmental Manager. Prior to working for WashDOT, he worked for 16 years for the Washington State Parks Department. Chris acknowledges that environmental justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion have always been part of the environmental field. When it comes to the IBR program, these tenets are more relevant than ever, and Chris's experience up to this point has prepared him well for the work at hand. He says it's less about vehicles and the roads and more about looking at the urban ecology of the Portland-Vancouver metro area, the transportation ecology, and the role of transportation agencies to ensure that project considers the history of earlier interstate projects that negatively impacted local equity priority communities. Thank you, Chris, for joining us tonight. Next, we have Megan Channel, who's joining us, who is the Rose Quarter Project Director. Megan Channel is the project director for the I-5 Rose Quarter Improvement Project with the Oregon Department of Transportation. She is responsible for project delivery through the environmental review, design, and construction phases of this transportation infrastructure and community building project. She has 17 years of experience in transportation, managing large-scale multimodal projects, applying corridor-wide visions, and building partnerships. Before joining ODOT, Megan previously worked for a San Francisco Bay Area transit agency and in the private sector consulting on transportation projects across the United States. She is an Oregon Daily Journal of Commerce Women of Vision awardee, currently serves on the WTS Portland Chapter Board's Executive Committee, holds a degree from UC Berkeley, and is a lead accredited professional. Thank you, Megan, for joining us tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce Walter Marchbanks. He is the Port of Portland's Customer Programs and Services Manager. Walter Marchbanks has been with the Port of Portland for over 10 years and has served in multiple roles, most recently serving as the Port of Portland's Customer Programs and Services Manager since July of 2016. In this role, he is primarily responsible for the PDX Canine Therapy Program, Airport-Wide Customer Service Program, or PDX People, and the PDX Volunteer Music Program. Throughout his career, Walter has fostered incredible partnerships with tourism agencies such as Travel Oregon and Travel Portland, diplomatic agencies, special needs agencies like Guide Dogs for the Blind, PSU Institute on Aging, etc., and all 75 plus tenants that operate out of PDX. Walter currently chairs the PDX Accessibility Committee, which serves to ensure that considerations and accommodations are made for all airport users, regardless of age or ability, and are factored into planned new construction. Thank you, Walter, for joining us tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce Pete DeVasto, who is a community member. Pete has been totally blind since birth and is now retired after a highly successful career in the computer industry, the last part of which involved helping companies like Adobe and Apple make their products more accessible for people who are blind or have low vision. Since 2018, he has been actively involved with the PDX Airport Accessibility Committee, assisting the port to make the new ticket lobby and the rest of the airport more accessible. He is also a member of the PDX Citizen Noise Advisory Committee, as well as the PDX 2045 Planning Advisory Committee. Prior to moving to Portland from the San Francisco Bay Area, Pete was on several accessibility advisory committees relating to paratransit and the commuter railroad that runs between San Francisco and San Jose. Thank you, Pete, for joining us. And last, but absolutely not least, is Ed Washington. He is the Community Advisory Group co-chair. Ed Washington is a civil rights leader and member of the Portland NAACP. In 1991, he became the first African-American counselor for the Portland Metro Council. As of 2015, he continues to serve as the community liaison for diversity initiatives and inclusion for Portland State University and as an adjunct professor for Portland Community College. He is currently a co-chair on the IBR Program's Community Advisory Group. Thank you, Ed, for joining us. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today to share your knowledge and your lived experience with us tonight. For participants in the Zoom room, please use the Q&A feature to submit your question. At the bottom of the screen, you should see a Q&A icon that you can click. And once you click that icon, a window will pop up for you to enter a question. If you join via a mobile device or your Zoom window is smaller, you may need to click the More button to access the Q&A icon. For those who are watching the live stream, you can email your questions to info@interstatebridge.org or simply send a direct message to the program depending on what social media site you're watching from. We will now start with the first prepared question for tonight. And so this is a two-part question. All of our questions, I invite the whole panel to provide responses, but I'll direct the question first. And so again, this is a two-part question. I'll start with Greg, Megan, and Walter. And so part one of this question is, in what ways can public comments enhance the planning and design of infrastructure projects? And part two is, can you provide any specific examples of public input leading to significant project adjustments? So starting with Greg, then Megan and Walter.
So, Lucy, there are a number of ways that public input can enhance a project. We, as transportation professionals, we have great ideas, but we don't have the market cornered on all great ideas. I've been a part of projects where we'd have the community come in and tell us that they would want to see something different than we had in mind. And that actually enhanced the project and made it more acceptable to the community. So having folks, whether it's a design element, whether it's um, a sidewalk placement, all of those type of things as we get further into design is going to be tremendously important to help inform our design teams of the community's desires. Because eventually this the community that lives with the project. So it is tremendously important and they can make a difference.
Thank you, Greg. Megan, how about you? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, as Greg said, there's so many ways that the public comment can enhance the infrastructure projects, primarily to ensure that we as public agencies are delivering projects that meet the public need and the community vision. Public comments can help identify those local needs and concerns and about identifying that local context. As Greg said, we don't know it all. We need the support of our community to make the outcomes as positive as they can be for what we're trying to deliver. Community members are providing valuable knowledge about the local environment. Are there historical issues? What are the community partnerships and relationships? Recognizing that, as we're delivering infrastructure projects, it's not just about the physical infrastructure. It's also about the relationships and the trust and the partnerships that you're building. And that's where the community can really help identify what those partnerships are, and how we can go about in our engagement process as well. The community insight can help anticipate potential impacts, and impacts being both positive and negative, through early identification of opportunities that allow the project teams to define delivery strategies, or potential early mitigation strategies up front. And this ultimately improves the project design overall, again, helping to match what the design is to meet those community values, and vision. And I think if there's an intentional and proactive approach set up, to make sure that you're, bringing in these public comments, that can ultimately just lead to a more equitable outcome for a broad range of users.
Awesome. Well, at PDX, we really see our airport as a reflection of the community that we ultimately serve. And, we're very proud in this region of our airport. PDX is sought after and looked to by many as one of the best airports in the country. And I think very strongly that one of the reasons for that is the way that we listen to the traveling public, the way that we listen to our employees. A lot of my work is really centered around engagement with community groups. And I will say with accessibility, while we do have several members of our accessibility advisory committee that are individuals, most of the feedback that we receive is through organizations. And there are numerous examples of opportunities that were highlighted by different organizations as we went through our last period of major redevelopment. I could look to the fact that we got feedback from the neurodivergent community that we needed a sensory room at PDX, and really responded to that by developing and building out our first sensory room, thanks largely to input from the community, from the autistic community, and folks that were, representing the Autism Society, ARC of Oregon, and other groups that supported those needs. I'd also look to an example where at PDX, we just opened our first all-user multi-stall restroom at PDX pre-security. And I will say, that was thanks largely to input that we received from Basic Rights Oregon, and really highlighting the importance of having that infrastructure at PDX. And at PDX, our senior manager of site and facility design, who is also a strong part of our accessibility advisory committee, believes strongly in universal design and really embodies a lot of those design standards. And a lot of those things that we have, a lot of the infrastructure and services that we have were largely informed thanks to community input that we received during our sort of iterative process going through the design piece and really getting that feedback to the front of that project. So those are some things that kind of come front to mind.
Thank you. And I really appreciate all of these ideas you all are bringing. And so, Megan, I'd love to come back to you on this, especially talking about Rose Quarter, because something that we talk about a lot is public input having impact, making it meaningful. Can you think of any specific examples from Rose Quarter or any other project that you've worked on where you did get to see that kind of impact on the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So many examples, but I guess I'll focus in on three. And they're all in the context of the Rose Quarter project. So first example would be the Rose Quarter project's design evolution with our highway cover. So for those that don't know, the I-5 Rose Quarter Improvement Project is building the first highway cover in the state of Oregon. Think of it as a land bridge or a cap over Interstate 5 that will be built to accommodate not only creating new land, but to accommodate new development on top. The project design that I'm describing here today was not the project design that we started with. And it really evolved through an intense and significant public comment process. So, rewind a decade, and the project originally included two separate highway covers that were more about, open space or bike and ped connections. And as we brought that forward to the community and really initiating our environmental review process for the Rose Quarter project, we heard from a number of organizations, a number of community members, community-based organizations, advocacy organizations that wasn't meeting the community vision for the area. So we, as ODOT, really took that to heart and took a step back, listening to our community partners, and actually brought in an independent consultant team to help us maybe see what we couldn't see, right? And look at the project design and help us identify, all right, what are the current community vision and values that we're trying to move forward? And with that, what are some design options that we could incorporate? And so there was a multi-year process that helped us ultimately get to one single longer and stronger highway cover that covers more of I-5, helps mitigate some of the impacts and concerns from the community, and most importantly, provides new developable space on top of I-5. And this is all in recognition of the history of our project area and the history of I-5. Back in the 60s when Interstate 5 was originally created, it disconnected and displaced Portland's Black community, the historic Albina community. And so as we were going through our project design and the highway cover specifically, we were trying to take a restorative approach and not be repeating those harms of the past, and think about how we could provide tangible benefits to historic Albina. So this highway cover was one way to do that. And I'd say was heavily and influenced and really the result of a community process. And I'll also add that we are now the recipient of the largest Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods grant on the order of $450 million to help deliver that highway cover. And I really think that that's a result of our community partnership and the community input that we've received to date. So that's a key example and probably the biggest one. A couple quick hits on two more. Given the context of NEPA and where the Interstate Bridge program is now, during our NEPA process, we also received comments on, questions or concerns around local street circulation or pedestrian safety at certain points of the project. And as we kind of went from our draft to final document, we incorporated some design changes to be able to address those comments specifically. I'll also note another way that we integrate public input is through our advisory committees. We have two as part of the Rose Quarter project. The first is the Historic Albina Advisory Board. They are made up of wholly individuals who represent historic Albina or have ties to historic Albina and are our leaders in helping to frame out our project design and our engagement process. And so they're with us every step of the way as our primary advisory body in informing how and what we're doing as part of our work. We also have a Community Opportunity Advisory Committee, which is members who represent different business entities or have contracting experience that are helping to inform our workforce program. And so they specifically have helped us do two things. One, provide input on our contractor specifications so that we're breaking down barriers early to help promote disadvantaged business enterprise opportunities. And then two, helped us create a diversity and subcontracting plan for the project that's setting some of the highest goals that ODOT has seen on a mega project for, again, workforce diversity and disadvantaged business enterprise utilization. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop there. Those are some key examples of how community input has really helped with Rose Quarter.
Thank you. Those are really wonderful examples. I'd love to hear from Ed and Pete, especially as folks who have worked on committees, worked on advisory groups, currently helping IBR on an advisory group in the case of Ed, but as being members of the public who have contributed so much to infrastructure projects, how your experiences have been in terms of being able to contribute input and seeing the impact of those contributions. I see Ed going for the mute button. There he is.
Sorry. Do you want me to say something now?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Megan had mentioned the advisory groups and advisory committees that helped out on Rose Quarter. And I think from your perspective, co-chairing one of the advisory groups on IBR, I'd love to hear your experience in terms of being able to provide input to the program.
Well, I think that perhaps one of the best things that has happened with this is the fact that they do have a citizen advisory group for Oregon and a citizen advisory group for the state of Washington. And you know, I think a lot of times I always take the word advisory pretty literal, is that we are there to advise, but there's nothing that say you cannot advise hard or you can advise softly. And I like our committee because I think they know when to advise hard and they know when to advise soft. And so I'm grateful for them. But, you know, as I look beyond our advisory groups, I think what really helps me to be able to work with those groups is that it's just my background. And one of the places that that I always use, I do a lot of presentations on about Vanport, and I go back and I remind people that, you know, 60, 70 years ago, there was no housing in this area for people that were coming out here to work in the shipyards. And Henry J. Kaiser was pretty straightforward about the needs. And as a result of that, I don't know if they had any advisory groups. I think Henry J. was probably a one-person advisor. But the good things that came from out of that, I look at a lot of what we're trying to do is that when you can build a city that will house 40 to 50,000 people in less than 9 months, it gives me a lot of hope for what we're trying to do today. The things that we need to do in housing, the things that we need to do in terms of transportation. If you can do what was done in Vanport in less than a year, and have a city, a complete city with schools, hospitals, police protection, grocery stores, 24-hour daycare centers, 24-hour nurseries. I mean, it was really remarkable. So I think that for me, that's the spirit that I try to bring to our advisory groups. and Lynn from over in the state of Washington. She never lived in Vanport, but she brings that same interest and that same will, and we're very fortunate to work with Greg and his staff, because at least you're working with somebody that listens. And I think that the way you win people over is that you must listen to what they have to say. And that is not always the case here, like in the city of Portland. We know that that doesn't happen as much as it should. But the only way you get things done, people must be a part of it. And you have to be honest with them. And sometimes you have to step back from your project and ask yourself, how does this really fits in? And how can we mesh all of this together? You know, because what we're really looking for is in our case, a new bridge across the Columbia River. And we need it. And so I just think that if you're going to call on citizens to help, make them feel needed. And I don't think that's a problem with the citizen advisory group. At least nobody's told me yet that they didn't feel like they were needed. But it does come with citizenship. I mean, with the leadership, and we're so fortunate to have Greg and his staff on board, because I have worked on a lot of projects, and sometimes stuff comes out of left field at you. And Greg, I just want to thank you for not throwing anything out of left field, because if you did, we probably would just throw it back, but in a very nice way. That's
so,
all I
Ed,
have to say.
And thank you for that, Ed. So you actually have organically brought us into the second question. And so I'm going to start with Pete, because I do want to stay kind of on some examples of maybe Pete's contributions, contributing to infrastructure projects. But talking about this again, because Ed, you kind of brought us here on the second question. And so, Pete, I'm going to start with you on this, talking about how do we engage equity priority communities to participate in this process, specifically those who historically have not been engaged in large transportation projects. You know, what works, what doesn't work? And again, you can think about it in that context of what examples have you been able to experience where input has made a difference. So I'll start with Pete, and then I would like to move back to you, Ed, on any additional thoughts before coming back to the group at large, talking about, again, how do we engage equity priority communities in this process? Pete? You're on mute, Pete. Let's see, still on mute. Hold on one second, Pete. There you are.
How's that?
Perfect.
If my screen reader doesn't play tricks again. The first thing I think you need to do is identify what, okay, I've obviously been involved in areas of, you know, people with disabilities, and you've got to identify what you want to address, and then identify groups that are involved with it. When I was on the, you know, as I'm still on the accessibility committee, one of the things that we did, we reached out to various organizations. The ones that come to mind for me are related to the blind. I'm thinking of Oregon Commission for the Blind, Portland State University. Walt, you can speak to other groups that we've reached out to in terms of people with other disabilities. I think the first thing that you need to do is to reach out to those groups, let them know what it is that you're intending to do, and then try to think about how what we want to do is going to help them. You want to get them interested by saying, this is going to be appealing to you. It's going to help people to use the bridge. I'm thinking of transportation. Is getting across the bridge going to be easier? I think about like TriMet and people who provide transportation for people with disabilities, are they going to have an easy enough time getting people across, from one state to the other?
Thank you, Pete. I really appreciate their perspective on this. I think, we all do, about making sure we have that intentionality and that consideration and that follow through. So we really appreciate your perspective there. Ed, any additional thoughts from you? I know you got to touch on this earlier, but before I opened it up to the wider group, did you have any additional thoughts on how we help engage equity priority communities on the project?
I think just continue to keep them involved and invited, not just for the sake of saying we have representation for this group or that group. I mean, those organizations know just as much about what's going on as those of us who are inviting them to join. And I think that it just needs to not be this big deal, but it needs to just always be a part of it. You don't move forward without making sure that you have everybody on board. Because as I look back over my time in the city of Portland, and I've lived here ever since I was 7 years of age, and 7 years old, and I've seen the changes, even though I did not understand all the ramification of those changes. I've seen those changes, and it's just astounding. We still sometimes continue to do the same thing over and over, and people really do get tired of it. So I'm so pleased to be part of the CAG, because, as well as others, because I do see a new approach. I do see a new involvement, and it should never be a surprise. It just, we're supposed to be there, and all these communities of color and various other communities of need, they need to be there also, because they cross the bridge, they drive on the roads, they are as much a part of what we are trying to do as anybody else. So I think we should always ask that question, but just don't ask it for the sake of asking. Let's make sure that when those organizations are invited, that they are made a vital part of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think if we do that, honestly, the rest will take care of itself. The rest will take care of itself. We just need to do it. And I think sometimes we get a little too comfortable with maybe those people that we know well. But it's time for other people. We need to get to know other people's just as well. So.
Thank you. And it's wonderful to be able to engage community members such as yourself in these spaces. I'd like to open it up to the panel at large now. Walter, Megan, Greg, Chris. Chris, I've gotten to see you engage with our advisory groups as well. If you wanted to speak to some of your experience being able to talk about some pretty technical topics with them, do you think you could maybe speak to some of the value that brings in terms of your work on the IBR program or outside the IBR program before you joined?
Yeah, for sure. And just wanted to start out again with great representatives here. Our advisory groups are a hotbed of ideas and great advice that we're getting from our equity advisory group, our community advisory group, accessibility, and being able to take concepts to that advisory group, especially technical ones that we can boil down, have a thorough engagement and bring back those concepts so that we can plug them back in to make that technical work a little bit more understandable, a little bit more straightforward, and to carry things forward is just invaluable. I'm a career bureaucrat working with the National Environmental Policy Act. I do process for a living, and that's not always fun for a lot of people. there's a lot of fun parts of it, and being able to engage and pull individuals in who are already advocates, either through our partners with our transit agencies, or our planning organizations, and understand how we can grab the excitement and enthusiasm from those groups and have them part of Interstate Bridge Replacement program is just going to make it a better program overall.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Walter, I see you came off mute.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to point out that our work around accessibility was really the byproduct of feedback that we received from another one of our advisory committees. So at PDX, we have 4 advisory committees. Pete, by my count, you're sitting on 3 of them. So your odds are pretty good here. But when it comes down to the feedback that we've been getting, our Citizens Advisory Committee, or CAC, back in 2018 came to the port and said, hey, port, you're entering into this big multi-year, multi-billion-dollar renovation of the airport. What are you doing to include the needs of disabled people as part of your design process and the way that you're crafting services? So our director of community affairs at the time got some internal stakeholders together and really sort of laid out the architecture that we have today, which includes now close to 30 different organizations that think about the needs of older adults, people with mobility needs, the deaf and hard of hearing community, the blind and low vision community, the neurodivergent community, think about English as a second language, and also thinking about gender equity. And there are representatives from all different organizations that filter into that, as well as individuals. And, the thought of accessibility and the concept of accessibility is certainly not new to PDX, thinking about having the Max coming right to the front door of the airport, or renting a rental car and having that walking distance from the terminal. Those are a lot of intentional steps that really predate our focused work around accessibility. But at PDX and our accessibility committee, we sort of live by the mantra of nothing for us without us. So when we really think about how we're going to do things, we really go through an intentional exercise around equity and thinking about how we're going to use an equity lens when we make any sorts of decisions, and make sure that we're including stakeholders to really craft and design the best informed decision that we can ultimately do, and ensure that we have as many voices at the table as we can to ensure that it's an inclusive process. That's all I wanted to add.
Well, Walter, while I've got you, I do have a follow-up question on that. So PDX has undergone a visible transformation. Even though it hasn't been through an environmental review process, it has been important to bring the public along through this process. How has the port helped equity priority community members get involved in and be supportive of the transformation?
Well, it's great that we've got Pete on the call today. I'm sure Pete could speak to what his experience is, but I would say that, one of the things that we really focus on is getting input and then acting on that input. And I think, to me, that's one of the most important aspects, is that we can look and focus on, provide tangible examples of things that we've heard and then things that we've done with that feedback. One of the things that we've heard is, there's really nothing more offensive than giving somebody your feedback, sharing your time, your most valuable gift, and then not feeling like you've been listened to or been heard, or feel like that feedback has been acted on. So we put a lot of intentionality with our committee members to really circle back and say, look, these are the things we heard you say. These are the things that we said that we were going to do. These are the things that we did. And then based on what you've said, these are the things that we're going to be continuing to focus on, and really use the committee and the committee's feedback to really drive priorities, help us understand where our energy, at least in certain things, should be really focused on too. And, really using that feedback as a way to really design and craft services and infrastructure that ultimately make the airport more inclusive.
I appreciate that. Now, Chris, I actually have a follow-up question for you, because we had talked about some technical documentation. As we all know, we're getting ready for the release of the draft supplemental environmental impact statement next Friday. Do you have any suggestions for us, Chris, that will help community members best understand the technical information provided in the draft and supplemental environmental impact statement, especially thinking about people who do not typically consume this kind of information? What suggestions might you have to help community members understand it?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Our program has quite an outreach force happening right now, trying to make sure that we're out having conversations with as many audiences as possible, helping them understand, being able to answer questions, and trying to find the right venues where we can reach as many people as possible. We, from the very beginning of the program, we've been going to city events. We've been having these roundtable discussions. We're going to continue to do that, and we're going to this time bring the details of the draft supplemental to those areas or to those different events, and be able to explain what is there and answer some questions to help folks understand how best to contribute to making a difference in the review and the comment period that is afforded by the National Environmental Policy Act.
Thank you. Now I'm actually going to put Greg on the spot here. Greg, you've been in the public infrastructure field for years now. Do you have examples of equity priority outreach and public input that has helped create the outcome of projects?
Lucy, that's a great question. And throughout my career, I've seen the evolution of public input being kind of marginalized in the beginning to now it's truly being valued. And I can think of some simple examples. West Michigan, when I was a young project engineer, we sat down with the community and we were building a project, and it was already designed, it was bid, and the community told us, well, you did not put us any sidewalks in. Our kids have to walk in the street or get muddy and when it's snowing. So having that type of community input and feedback is critical. So you have to sometimes change your plans. You may think you have perfect things, and you sometimes have to go back and reevaluate and add things in. Another example was working on the Gordie Howe Bridge project between Detroit, Michigan and Windsor, Ontario. And we had numerous times where we would sit in community members' living rooms listening to their concerns about how this would impact their neighborhood and trying to make sure that their voices were heard. And in years past, those type of things were not the top priorities for DOTs. But nowadays, DOTs have changed, and they're doing a much better job of engaging and listening to the concerns of the community. So once again, this project is the epitome of listening, of taking in community comments and acting upon them, and not just listening and putting the comments on a shelf or somewhere in a drawer. So this is the height of an example of this in my career.
Thank you, Greg. For me, it kind of leads into our next question because, while we make these efforts to reach out to equity priority communities, there are still some very real barriers that they face. And so for this next question, it's another two-part question. And while I hear answers to it, Greg and Chris, I want you to be thinking about how the IBR program is working to reduce some of these barriers. But I'd like to pose this question to Pete, Ed, and Walter first, before turning to Greg and Chris to hear about how the IBR program is working to reduce these barriers. But Pete, Ed, and Walter, can you speak to some of the barriers that equity priority communities face in participating in the public comment periods? I will first turn it to Pete. Yep,
Okay, am I here now finally?
Yep.
Okay. Probably for me, and it's not only been when I am on accessibility committees. As it was so nicely stated, I've also been involved with paratransit committees in the Bay Area and whatnot. My career also involved accessibility of computer products. One of the biggest barriers that I always see whenever you approach someone to do anything related to accessibility is we don't have enough money. And what happens is they say that we have other priorities, and so we would rather spend our money on those things rather than on the accessibility issues. And one of the things, and maybe leading to the second part of the question, I don't know, forgive me if I am, the thing that I have always done, and I will give a prime example. One of the things, like when you're trying to use a computer and you can't see the mouse or the screen, there are other ways to get things done besides using the mouse. And the biggest one is the keyboard. And what happens is that when I tell people that you can use the keyboard and they learn things that they can do with the keyboard, some of them will come back and say, oh, I never thought of that. And I can do things that are much easier and quicker. And so where I'm going with it is that whatever group you approach, try to think if there are things that can be done outside the box. In other words, there may be other people besides the people you are trying to target that will benefit from what you're going to do.
Thank you, Pete. Walter or Ed, same question to you all, or responses to Pete?
Yeah, I'd say, when I think about, reducing barriers to entry, one of the things that the port implemented a few years ago was a community stipend process for community engagement on advisory committees, which has been a really important thing. So, while, again, we partner primarily with organizations, and, organizations by and large compensate members of those organizations for their time. So whether we're, working with a executive director or somebody who's with the organization, generally speaking, they'll be compensated by the organization, but not always. And when that doesn't happen, and even if it did, we have a process to, offer compensation based on the amount of time that folks are investing. We also compensate people for their travel time if it involves being on site. Obviously, a lot of things can be done virtually, like today, right? But not always, right? Sometimes, you need to touch a fixture, you need to experience a space or experience something firsthand. And, when those things happen, reducing the barrier to entry, one of the things that we really focus on is by valuing people's time, and, for us, that's really been an important part. That's been, one of the, helpful ways that we've been able to get, Pete out to the airport so often. I'm picking on you, Pete, but, we certainly, work with Pete a lot. And work with other community members to come out. So again, I think that stipend policy has really benefited all of our advisory committees, not just the accessibility committee that I'm on, and really created more engagement by sort of valuing people's time in a compensatory way. So.
Thank you, Walter. Ed, I turn to you. Any thoughts from you on this, talking about the barriers again for equity priority communities?
Your question is a tough one, and I don't mean it's so tough that I can't say something about it, but it's a tough one because I just sit here reflecting today's bridge, and then think about when the bridge was built the last time, and I think about the not just the African American community, but I think about the African American community. If when all of the stuff was going on in the I-5 corridor, maybe back then, if the transportation department had sent a person like Greg to Portland to manage this process, I just wonder I think the look would be different today. And so because we know that that where the I-5 corridor runs on the Oregon side, it does not run through the African-American community that I grew up in. And I'm not saying this to cry sour grace. I'm just saying that's just the way it is. And so I think you look at all the people that you have around this table today, and you look at the expertise that they all bring to this project, plus all of the people that are sitting on our committees. We're going to do fine, I think, with this. But in terms of really having an impact, we may be about 25 years too late. So I only say that, not like I say, not because of sour grapes, but I just sit here and think about where I used to live. And I don't live in that area any longer. And neither does most of my friends and lots of other people. So I just think that what we are all doing, whether we know it or not, is that we're probably saying, 35, 40 years from now, when we'll probably have to do this again, it may have a totally different look to it. And perhaps maybe what we're doing can help us to change some of the dynamics that exist today as a result of some of the decisions that were made 20-some years ago. I hope I'm making sense to you. Making perfect sense to myself.
Oh, absolutely, Ed. At least for me, what we're talking about here isn't just building a bridge, right?
Yes.
We're talking about the legacy of the project that built this bridge.
Yeah.
And so I would love to turn to Greg and to Chris to talk about some of these barriers and how IBR is working to reduce some of them so we can have a project that we can look back on proudly and say, we did it right.
So Lucy, I think one of the key underpinnings of getting folks, having them come to the table in an authentic way, is to start creating trust. And we have been working on that issue from day one when I stepped on this project to say, how can we make sure that the community can trust us, that they believe in what we're saying, that we follow through on things that we've made promises to the community. So that's that first step. And then other tools that are more the practical things, you have to, as Walter said, you have to compensate people for their time and make sure that you're just not having folks self-select out of processes because they can't afford to be a part of it. So having compensation, setting meeting times that meet the needs of folks, because if I'm retired, if I can do it at any time, but if I'm a working person, I may need to have you have advisory meetings or input meetings at a later time on weekends, and all type of tools. Bringing folks in with different languages. Our program has, I think, 12 written languages and 8 spoken languages that we translate our documents into. It is an effort, but it is an effort in saying we value the input of everyone. If English is a second language for you, that should not be a barrier to input. We also look at, you see we have American Sign Language on all of our meetings. We want to make sure that folks who are hard of hearing can participate. So it's those tools that we try and bring to bear to get people to number one, trust us that we are being authentic when we're trying to get their opinions and viewpoints on our program. So those are the things, but underlying all of it is creating a trust that we will do what we say we're going to do.
Boy, it's really hard to add a whole bunch to what Greg just said, but throw a couple of those, those practical things out there that we're focused on as well. And the main goal really is to understand the needs of those individuals who need access to the information so that we can make sure that they're part of the process. And we just need to get the word out where the words can be heard, and have it make sense, and then provide the opportunities to make sure that the feedback we're getting is, as Greg said, part of that trust, incorporated into the way that we're looking at this moving forward. And so we've got a multifaceted approach. We are using technology, we're using spoken and written words, we're providing documents in different places. We're asking our advisory committees, how can we do this better? Are there specific areas that we need to target and make sure that our words are getting out to those areas? We're creating search functions that is going to help people get through the document and focus in on what is important to them. And we're having open house office hours so that if there's questions or if people need help, we can be there to make sure that we help meet those needs to get that feedback that we need.
Thank you, Chris and Greg. Before I move on from here, I'd actually love to hear from Megan on this. The Rose Quarter Project has evolved to meet the needs and desires of the community members. What have you found best elevates and serves the concerns of equity priority communities?
Yeah, I will. I'm going to tell a story around how we got to the advisory committee, our Historic Albina Advisory Board that we have today. So when we first initiated the project, we set up a standard community advisory committee. And looking back, it could have been an advisory committee for any transportation or any infrastructure project in Portland. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as we took a step back and reflected, if our value is to incorporate equity, if our intention is to, again, acknowledge the harm that ODOT played when I-5 was constructed, again, in displacing the African-American community, you've heard Mr. Washington mention that. And if our intention is to provide tangible benefits to historic Albina, we didn't get it right. We didn't get this community group right. And that wasn't an easy decision. But, as you talk about barriers, that was a barrier that we set up just by, who we were bringing to the table as an advisory committee. And so we owned that. And we actually ended up sunsetting our community advisory group, and we reset with the Historic Albina Advisory Board. And the Historic Albina Advisory Board was reset to incorporate individuals, again, that have ties to historic Albina, past, present, and future. And it's the Historic Albina Advisory Board has been in place now for about 3 years. And I think it's a reflection of standing behind your values to be able to move a process forward. And don't be afraid to course correct as an agency. So often we can get very stuck in our ways, and just because we did it that way before we made a decision, we feel like we can't kind of take that big public moment and say, yeah, actually didn't get that right. We're gonna take a different approach. So I'd encourage, in the context of public comment, I recognize you're entering the NEPA process, but public comment on process is also very important too. So all that is to say, our Historic Albina Advisory Board has really helped us carry forward a lot of the perspectives from the community that we're trying to serve. And so I think that's an example of how the Rose Quarter Project has evolved to bring that equity priority forward.
Thank you, Megan. And I think what you said about not being afraid to course correct is so important. You know, when we have one idea of equity and how best to do it, to be able to observe and see what's working, what's not working, and make the changes needed, I think is so important, especially on a project where with a prolonged timeline, but an even greater timeline for how long it'll impact and benefit the community. So I really appreciate that insight. Um, and so I appreciate everyone for all of those insightful and wonderful responses. I'd now actually like to open the floor to questions from our participants currently watching. And so once again, I really invite everyone to please submit your questions using the Q&A feature or to email us. Again, the Q&A button's down at the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom, or you can email us at info@interstatebridge.org. And we'll address as many questions as we can in the time that we have left. So coming in, I already have our first question. And so group, I turn to you all. I'll actually go ahead and start maybe with Megan, Walter, and Greg. Starting with you, Megan, just because we've already gotten onto this topic. What does it mean to ensure equity in the public comment process? And how do we measure the success of our efforts to engage diverse voices? And so, you know, you had spoken about the course correction. How do we monitor? How do we see we are successful? How do we even define that success?
Yeah, that's a great kind of two-part question there. So what does it mean to ensure equity in public comment process, and how do we measure that success? So, you know, in the context of public comment for a NEPA process, like as you're embarking on here with IBR, I'll offer my perspective on the experience we just had in completing our environmental review process for the Rose Quarter project. So I think first, you know, equity in the public comment process really takes a deliberate and intentional approach to ensure that all communities not only have awareness in the process, but access to a voice in the process, with a recognition that some communities may need a different approach than others to have said access to that. And again, a lot of that focuses on building trust, kind of building on what Greg said earlier. I think it's also important to make sure that you're incorporating the local and regional context into the public comment process. So I guess what I mean by this is the NEPA process, while very important, it provides a prescriptive federal process that's for any public comment for any infrastructure project across the US. And it's a great baseline to start from, but it's also important to bring in the local context. So to be supplemented kind of with going above and beyond and what makes sense for the community or the communities that you're serving. As an example, kind of in the context of Rose Quarter, again, I'll go back kind of building on my story a moment before, but we identified communities that were historically harmed by the initial construction of I-5, Portland's Black community, Portland's historic albino community. And in recognition of these voices not being represented when I-5 was originally constructed, which led to where it is today, you know, we wanted to take, again, that restorative approach and not repeat that harm of the past, and ensure that we were centering our outreach and engagement with Portland's Black community, with Portland's historic albino community. So, you know, again, I mentioned we stood up the Historic Albino Advisory Board. I also will note that as we have a couple other examples, you know, as we've hosted public events, I'll go to our public hearing that we held for our environmental assessment. We actually we had people self-identify whether they were from a equity priority community as they were signing up for public testimony. And we made sure that we were providing those individuals that self-identified as such to be first in line for that testimony. And that kind of helped, I guess, maybe identify the power dynamic typically involved in our public processes, and that there are going to be some organizations and entities that you know all the ins and outs and have been involved in these processes for years. And so we wanted to make sure that voices that are maybe not typically engaged in that same way, or have been, you know, afforded the opportunity to be as invested as others, that they were there first to be able to provide their voice in the process. So that was one way we were kind of helping address and bring equity to the forefront. I think, how we measure this, my God, that's a really hard question. And we're ever improving on it. But, I think a couple of ways that we've done this on Rose Quarter is all the comments that we've received, be it, within the scope of the NEPA process or within the broader bounds of overall public comment, we're identifying the comments and themes that are coming from equity priority communities and making sure, in addition to all the scopes of comments that we're receiving, that we're centering those and making sure that that's available to decision makers before decisions are made. And this requires bringing in individuals who can help identify, equity priority communities in that comment process, and also setting it up where people can self-identify as such. You need that strong team that has a pulse on those communities to bring those comments forward. So I guess as a last piece, I'll say that we also have a lot of discussions and ask directly kind of, are we meeting your needs for access to information and the decision-making process? This comes up a lot in our community engagement events and our Historic Albina Advisory Board, as well as our Community Oversight Advisory Committee. They're there as that accountability body as well as an advisory body. And I think just having, once you begin to build some trust, you can have those conversations to have a kind of a tangible measurement conversation to see how you're doing, and then adjust or pivot as you need to.
Thank you.
I will say we are consistently learning from others on how we can best measure this. So I really look forward to hearing from others too.
And I think we're going to hear some great insight. I will say I really appreciate that acknowledgement of power dynamics as its own element to consider as we talk about these things. And I would also say that deliberate, intentional asking, are your needs being met, is something that's so important that sometimes we forget to do, just as people. So I really appreciate that acknowledgement. Walter, I turn to you.
Yeah, I'd say, first and foremost, just being involved in this dialogue and meeting the panelists. And this has been a very educational exercise for me. I've never been personally involved in a specific public comment period per se, but what I can say is that, ensuring that, we're really thinking about the needs of all of the different groups that access the airport as part of that process, and not just taking the loudest voice. I think really being intentional about how we, develop our roadmaps. We had a series of road mapping sessions that, while most of our accessibility committee meetings are as a quorum, right? They're a large group, and, we've done them in a way where we have kind of a 6-month retrospective, and we look ahead 6 months, and we have some guest speakers, and we do some on-site work. Back in February, we did a road mapping exercise where we actually broke up into specific user groups. So we had a group of, representatives of the Accessibility Advisory Committee that were older adults. And we had a group of individuals that were from the deaf and hard of hearing community, and some that were from the blind and low vision community. And we had focused dialogue around, here's what we heard you say back in the beginning, right? Back when we initiated this work, and we've been listening, and we've been, using our working documents and keeping a good, documentation along the way. But, how are we doing, and what are the priorities, right? We looked at the short range, needs. We looked at the mid-range needs, and then we looked at things that were more aspirational, and we really broke those down based on user groups, because we really wanted to make sure, number one, you can see where there's intersectionality, which is really important. But number two, you can really get a sense of where people's priorities are in a really focused and intimate setting and environment, right? And that has really been one of the things that really resonated with me. I was really struck by Megan when she mentioned the awareness piece of all of this, right? Like, if people don't know that there's a public comment period, how are they to know how they're supposed to engage with that? I was driving in, to work the other day and listening to NPR, and they were having a conversation with PGE about rate increases and how that process looked. And I'll be darned if I didn't, go on and look at the public comment piece after I got back home. I thought, okay, well, this is something that I took away from that. And had I not heard about it, I mean, sure, there's been inklings of it, but I didn't know that there was a public comment period. It was one of those things where that was, I'm sure, part of a broader communications campaign that centered around the public comment period and process. So, I'm sure that there's a lot, to that, but for me, I think really equity, centers around making sure that you're really trying to be inclusive with how you're listening, not just listening to the loudest voice, but really making sure that you're thinking about how you're reaching out to. The last thing that I'll leave you with is that, when we think about, back to Ed's comment about, yeah, we're not just building a bridge. I think about we're connecting communities. This project is about connection, right? It's about connecting Oregon and Washington. And that's such a critical artery that we have. It's such a critical connection. And, I'm just really proud of the work that the team is doing to really think about how you're engaging with the community, how you're trying to seek out public comment, and really putting a lot of intentionality behind the equity process. So honestly, it's been a pleasure to just be part of this whole experience as well.
Thank you, Walter. Turning now to Greg, as we're talking about this, you have a wealth of experience in this field, but now talking about it for the IBR program, going into this public comment period, what does it mean to ensure equity during this public comment period process? And how are we going to measure the success of those efforts to engage diverse voices?
So I think you have to look at this as not just the public comment period. You have to look at this as a longer term efforts that have been put forward. This team has been, one of the first things we did was name a principal equity officer for the program who looked at our processes and looked at our outcomes to say, okay, are we being equitable in how we are running the program, how we are doing outreach? So that was one of the first basic things that we did. And we can't guarantee that we're going to have this groundswell of folks who come and comment. But what we can guarantee is that we have done all of the work necessary to prepare people for it. As Megan and had mentioned before, making sure people know is one of the key things. So we have our outreach, we're sitting at fairs and festivals almost every weekend to reach a broader part of the community. We put together micro grants to community-based organizations to help amplify our reach into those hard to reach communities who generally wouldn't participate in programs like this. So I think we've laid a great foundation for equitable input and equitable voices being heard on this project. So I can't guarantee you that all those folks are going to come out, but what I can guarantee you is that we have made great efforts to make sure those voices know about this and that they know how important this is.
Thank you, Greg. Chris, coming from your perspective on the program as well, I didn't know if you had any other thoughts to add on this process, but to Greg's point, it's not a finite process, but how important this is to you right now.
I'll say something probably that Greg wouldn't. Part of the way to get the outcomes we're looking for is to create a very strong vision, make sure that we center a program around delivering through an equity lens and through a climate lens, and creating the leadership that drives us there. And the IBR program has done a great job setting that up, moving us forward. We need to get the word out. We're doing everything we can. We need to hear the diversity of thought that's going to help make this a great program. And I think we're poised for that. The other thing that our community engagement group, our public affairs community engagement group did early on was collect some demographic data and compared the comments that we had received early on to the makeup of our advisory groups, and saw how well our advisory groups were representing the overall comments. And so that gets to your comment or the question about how do we measure success. that feedback, looking at that and making sure that we've honed it the right way, it was a good stroke of data collection, and it reinformed that we were focused the right direction. But it's also something that we can use to correct and make sure that we've got the voices that we need at our advisory group, that we're reaching out to those individuals that need to make a difference to make this a better program.
Thank you, Chris. You're all speaking so much to not just these, formal groups or finite groups, but all of these consistent opportunities for outreach and community engagement that really underscores the importance of the intentionality of this engagement. And I think that's such an important theme to highlight as we talk about these enormously impactful projects. I'd love to hear from Pete or Ed on this as well, talking about this public comment process again. With these highly technical documents, and it can maybe seem intimidating to some community members. And so any thoughts from either of you on how we engage our communities and ensure that it is equitable in how we're engaging with them to get their comments on this supplemental environmental impact statement? I see Ed.
Oh, Pete, did Pete want us? Pete, were you ready to say something?
Pete, you are on mute.
I really don't have very much that I can say at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ed.
I was trying to pass it off to you. But, I think that something that just really struck in the right place for me tonight and listening to everything. And I think that there has been some wonderful, wonderful comments. But Megan, I'm so struck by what you said with regards to Rose Quarters. And if I'm not stating you correctly, it's okay to correct me. But you mentioned that you said, we didn't find it that, please, I'm going to speak, and if I'm wrong, you didn't find it that difficult to course correct. And I think that is probably, everybody else has made some wonderful statements, so I'm not comparing. That is just, to me, the heart of what we do in this business. And so many times we would save ourselves tons of tears if we realized it's okay to course correct. It's okay. And I'm so happy to hear you say it and to say it publicly, because I just think it's one of the things that nobody want to course correct. Because nobody wanted to, well, I messed up. No, you didn't mess up. You said, we need to course correct. I love it. And I just think that to me is one of the most powerful statements. Not that the rest of you didn't make powerful statements, but that's one of the most powerful statements and we should remember that. It's okay to course correct.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate that. That again, moving into this really important next step for the IBR program. Chris, I'd love to return to you on this. For people and community members out there who might be trying to imagine what's ahead right now, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what will the draft SEIS even look like? For folks who have never participated in a NEPA process before, what can we expect it to look like?
Well, it's a beautiful document, Lucy. It's a very large document. The typical environmental document starts with a discussion of the program, the problem statement, and then goes into analysis of the environmental aspects. Problem statement. It goes into the proposed solution for the problem statement, and then goes into how implementing that solution would impact different elements of the environment. That's the typical way that this is set up, and a person can go through, read an executive summary, go through, look at the statements of a purpose and need, and then see how the program intends to solve that. Along with that, then again, like I said, there will be a lot of outreach by the program to help answer questions, to help make sure that if there's any barriers to understanding, we can help provide some resources to get us to that understanding. And then we've got a number of different ways to make comments for those different concerns or additional information that people want to add to our program. I'm sorry that I'm not going into too much detail about the volume of that, but that's the general setup of a supplemental EIS. We'll also have access to the previous document that was completed about a decade ago, called the Columbia River Crossing. We can get that document as well as the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program's Draft Supplemental EIS, so that people can go through and look at both of those and see how things have changed.
Thank you, Chris, for that preview. It's going to be, a major document, and I mean, I'm excited now that you've sold it as being beautiful. I'm
It's
looking
beautiful.
so very forward to it. I feel like we've barely gotten to skim the surface on the topic. There's so much to talk about here. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time, but I really wanted to turn things over to Greg. Greg, I'd love some parting thoughts from you or closing remarks in terms of all we've heard about tonight and steps as we're moving forward now.
So first off, Lucy, thank you for doing a great job of facilitating this group. This has been fun. These type of forums are always great to participate in. I always learn some new things, and this is such an important topic for folks to see themselves in this project. So I've walked this bridge across and back 43 times, and one of my favorite things to do is when I walk across it is to read the plaques that adorn either quadrant of the bridge, and it makes you proud to understand the foresight that the folks who put the original bridge there had. And what it also makes you think is that they probably did not go to the community and do the type of things that we're doing. So in one way, they did great things. In another way, they probably said, this is what we're going to build, get out of our way, let's go. Those days are behind us. We are now in this period in transportation where we look for community engagement. I tell folks that our program is data informed, but community driven. And to me, that is so important. You can have a data driven project that will fall on its face if you don't have the community sitting right next to you helping steer what this project will look like. So IBR has invested greatly in our community engagement, in the outreach that we have done in trying to reach those equity priority communities. We've done press conferences with youth. We've done press conferences with minority-owned press outlets. All of these things are tremendously important to make sure that folks, once again, I'll go back to that word, trust, that we are trying to get their input, that we really want their input. So the comments from this panel, and I've been taking notes as we've been going forward. Just some excellent ideas and thoughts. And I once again just appreciate everyone being here. And as we go into this public comment period starting at the end of next week, we're going to come back to folks and make sure that they, once again, know what we're doing and how important it is. So this is just another step in that informing process. So I want to thank everyone for their participation and their great comments and input on this tremendously important issue.
Thank you, Greg. And I would like to echo that I truly want to thank each and every one of our panelists for joining us tonight. I would also really like to thank those who are watching at home on Zoom or on social media. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us on this. For folks who are watching, if we did not get to your question tonight, please email us at info@interstatebridge.org. We will get you an answer to your question. The recording of this roundtable will be available on our website and YouTube channel soon. If you'd like more information on future events, to schedule a briefing for your group, or speak to staff one-on-one during office hours, please visit our website at www.interstatebridge.org. You can also stay in touch with the program through our newsletter and social media. We at the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program thank you for your time and have a wonderful evening.